Yeah, it's an interesting question. We have a chapter that's specifically on this, like, is Queen still Queen, with Adam Lambert or not? So it is an interesting question. First, I guess the first thing that stands out to me is the point that you made that they are still so important, so popular, which is kind of crazy. I actually looked up some of their most recent like streaming information just to see how things are standing, and it's really impressive, really remarkable. So according to the information that I found, Queen are currently like number 51 most streamed artists on Spotify, like in the world. And if you look at that list, almost every single other group on that list is a modern group. The only other like older artist that was on that list was Elton John. I think he was like 42 or something when I saw. But Queen has like somewhere in the neighborhood of 44 million monthly listeners on Spotify. Yeah, which is impressive, especially for a group that formed 50 years ago and hasn't written really new music in the last 30 years. So other than it's them and Elton John, everyone else like in the top 100 is a modern artist. Interestingly, the Beatles were at like 123 or something like that. And like, so I thought that was interesting. And then I also looked up the most streamed songs of all time, not just like the total listens. So the recent info that I got, and I'm sure this changes, pretty frequently, but Bohemian Rhapsody was number 24 on the top 100 streamed songs of all time, and Don't Stop Me Now was 100. And again, they're the oldest band on that list by decades. It's great. Like there was, I think, almost all of the songs on the top 100 are in the last, 5-10 years. There's a few from the early 2000s. I think there was one from the 90s, none from the 80s, and then those two Queen songs from the 70s. So they're like by a mile the oldest, longest running group that's still on these, incredibly popular lists. Bohemian Rhapsody has 2 billion streams or whatever it is, like these kinds of things. So yeah, I guess the first thing is really just to emphasize that point that you made, that they are and still remarkably popular, and how great that is. So to answer the question a little bit, and this is just my opinion, one of the most important things probably for their recent success is the movie Bohemian Rhapsody that came out in 2018. It's probably not a shock that the two musical groups that had like a biopic in the last fight, like Elton John and Queen, are still on the list. And if you look, like their highest streaming was right when the movie came out in 2018, like their top peaks and stuff on Spotify. But obviously they were popular before then. They've always been popular. They've remained popular. So the movie bump definitely helped and is probably still helping them. But I think there's more to it than that. It's a good thing, I would say, that they're still touring, even with, the replacements, Paul Rodgers, Adam Lambert. I think being active, having shows that people can go and see, I think that makes a difference. I also think, just a few things on this, they got really lucky with Adam Lambert, I would say. I think he does a great job. He doesn't feel like he's trying to usurp Freddie or take him over, but in sort of channeling that spirit in a really nice way. I think they also do a really tasteful job in their live shows of honoring Freddie and remembering him. Like they'll use videos or audio of his original vocals, or even like the holograms and things like this, to sort of honor and remember him. And it's not as if they're trying to forget his legacy or anything like that. So it really does feel like they're honoring his legacy. And I think fans appreciate that. And that kind of allows them to keep going out and keep touring and making and playing the music without there being a backlash. So I think the movie helps. I think the touring helps. Honestly, I don't know how to quantify this, but I think the stadium effect probably helps. We Are the Champions, We Will Rock You have to still be some of the most played songs at like sporting events and these great big arena, events, and just that cultural ubiquity that you get from streaming music out to 80,000 people at a time at these very intense moments that people are very passionate about. I think that probably helps. But honestly, at the end of the day, I think it's about the music, right? Obviously, you would say that. Um, the quality of the writing, the quality of their performances, the personas that they crafted, just the whole complete package. I think, obviously I'm a fan, so I would say they're one of the best groups. They're my personal favorite group of all time. And so I think even all of that, none of that other stuff would be happening if it weren't for the original quality of the group in every aspect. So that's the most important thing, I would say. Yeah, I mean, without going into too much detail and just kind of touching on a few different things, there's the historical, sort of biographical details that, depending on the level of the fan and how interested they are, or how much they already know about Queen's history or their biographies, they're probably going to learn something. Whether that's Freddie's relationships, kind of the band's early formation and early studio experiences. We have a chapter on Roger Taylor's solo work, and maybe not a lot of people are familiar with that. Their work on Highlander, for the soundtrack for the Highlander film. Maybe clear up some misunderstandings that the movie did create. Obviously that the Bohemian Rhapsody movie is not historically accurate in a lot of ways, right? It's kind of a modified version to hype up the narrative. So maybe if people have only ever seen the movie and that's all they know about Queen's history, they might have some misconceptions that could get cleared up. So there's I guess, the biographical details, events and interesting facts about the band's career. There's some musical analysis that maybe fans of Queen might find interesting, especially if they're kind of musically inclined. We have a few chapters that dive into um, sort of music analysis. For example, we have a chapter on the way that the band uses their left hands, right? How the left hand, like Freddie's left hand on the piano or Brian's on the guitar, like how they use their left hand in an interesting and unique way that adds to the musicality of the group that you don't see. Or sort of the relationship between Queen and mathematics and science, relating to the Pythagoreans and their use of the musical scales and intervals and how that plays a role in Queen's music. Or we have a chapter that analyzes Who Wants to Live Forever, the song Who Wants to Live Forever, and their use of the E minor key and relating to like Haydn's Troyer Symphony and Chopin and these kinds of things. So some interesting musical analysis. And then probably the most important thing, or maybe the thing that people would be coming to the book for, would obviously be the philosophical insights as well, right? So you have the biographical pieces, the sort of the musicality, musical analysis pieces, but then the philosophy. And obviously there's too much to mention here, but from philosophy and astrophysics and alchemy and outsider art and matriarchal religions and existentialism and Buddhism, Socrates and Aristotle, psychology and mental health. There's a lot of different themes that we pick up and relate from philosophy and other interdisciplinary backgrounds and try and bring to the light of the band's work and their life, and saying something that maybe you've never heard about or thought about before. So I think there's hopefully something of interest to fans of Queen who don't know anything about philosophy. There's something of interest to fans of philosophy who don't know anything about Queen. And if you happen to be in the Venn diagram like I am of both, then it's great. It should be a perfect book for you. So I wanted to do. My first thought is that I wanted to focus on Queen's earlier work. I personally, I'm a big like prog rock, pop prog metal person, so I like the more progressive strains in Queen, and you get that a lot with their sort of first couple albums. And I also just think that early period is very interesting, and I wanted to talk on some of the, the formation of the band and their early, not struggles, but early adventures, in coming together. And so my personal favorite Queen album is Queen 2, which is, I think makes me a hipster, because that's literally their, if you're not counting Flash Gordon, which is more of a soundtrack than an actual album, it's literally their least popular album, statistically, from like streaming, sites and stuff like this. So other than Flash Gordon, it's their least listened to album. So, but I love it, and I think it's really interesting. And that album is divided up. It kind of has an interesting structure to it. So it was released as a side white and a side black. And that album, that's actually the famous Bohemian Rhapsody music video of the 4 heads floating in the black. That image first comes from like the liner of Queen 2, like the side black. So that's where they got that image from, and then used it for that music video for Bohemian Rhapsody later. So the album is divided up into a side white and a side black. And side white is almost entirely Brian May's songs. So he wrote all those songs. And then side black, the second side of the album, was all Freddie's songs. So I thought that was kind of cool and kind of interesting and fit into like a nice, clean philosophical structure. So I wrote 2 chapters, one on side white, one on side black. And so, yeah, that was my first thought. And then I started looking, all right, well, what do I want to talk about in each of these sides? Like, what's the most philosophically rich and interesting? And the first place that I started was, if you look at the album, there's this parallel. So in Side White, Brian has a song called White Queen, As It Began. And then Side Black, Freddie has a song called March of the Black Queen. And I thought that was sort of interesting. I'm a big fan of like mythology and philosophy of mythology and anthropology and these kinds of like philosophical anthropology. And so I found that kind of interesting. And so I wanted to do something on Queen's use of female imagery. From the name of the band, obviously, to all the songs about mothers, like Mother Mercury and Mama Just Killed, like the references to mothers and queens and strong female figures is all throughout their work, literally from their first album to their last album. And I found that really interesting. So I wanted to talk about that. So for the one chapter that I wrote, which is on the Side White chapter, it's called Worshipping the White Queen. And basically it's talking about what Brian May's inspiration was on the song White Queen As It Began, which is actually really philosophically interesting. To put it in a nutshell, it's basically a chapter on matriarchal religion and paganism, sort of in relation to Queen. I don't know how much you know about matriarchal religion or something, but it's very interesting. So these religious movements that put like strong female deities at the center, right? And when Brian was writing that song, and he talks about this in some interviews and some biographies of the group, he was at school. There were basically two influences. One was pretty straightforward. He was at school at the Imperial College London, and he had this crush, this unrequited crush on this girl that he sort of saw from afar and thought, oh, she's this goddess, but he never talked to her, never did anything. But then he was also, Queen, they're very academic, they're very intellectual, right? Most of them, Brian May has a PhD in astrophysics, right? And so he was reading at the time a book called The White Goddess that was written by a guy named Robert Graves. And this book is actually really interesting. It's had sort of a troubled history in academia, like historians and anthropologists and scholars of religious studies. He didn't quite have the history right, maybe, but it ended up being a very sort of popularly influential book. So on like kind of the hippie movement of the 60s and kind of new pagan traditions, this book was very influential. And so Brian was reading this book and combined sort of his interest in this book on matriarchal religion and this, crush that he had on this woman, and he wrote this song, "The White Goddess," sort of referencing themes from Graves's book. So that's the impetus of it, without diving too much into detail. But basically, Graves talks about this. He has this theory about. He thought that sort of ancient Bronze Age European society was matriarchal and worshipped a sort of a mother goddess that he describes as sort of a triplicate moon goddess, like this like maiden mother crone sort of stereotype, right? And so he has this thesis that originally Europeans worshipped this matriarchal goddess, and that only later did these patriarchal gods come in sort of from the East, and Indo-Iranians and these kinds of things. And now we have sort of a more patriarchal. And so he examines some of how he thinks that plays out in the history of Europe. Some of it is maybe speculative, some of it, but it's an interesting idea. And it's, I don't want to spoil the chapter too much, but if I can give you my big conclusions. So, I mentioned it's a triplicate moon goddess. You've got the white goddess. You've got the young maiden version, her that maiden face. Then you've got the red goddess, the war and fighting and these kinds of things. And then you've got the black goddess, the when the moon is black and dark, and you've got death and these kinds of things. And maybe it's a coincidence, but there's only 3 songs that have mentioned the word queen. If you set aside their the British national anthem and this kind of stuff, the Queen wrote 3 songs that have the word queen in the title. There's a queen, or sort of a yeah. So we've got the White Queen, As It Began. We've got March of the Black Queen, both from that Queen 2 album, and then we've got Killer Queen, a white queen, a red queen, and a black queen. So I thought that was interesting. Maybe that's just, could be coincidence, but I thought it was interesting and maybe meant something. So that's the white side of the album. And then on the black side of the album, you'd think that I would focus on March of the Black Queen, because that would be the parallel. I did talk about that some in both chapters, but really there's a song on side black that I found just completely fascinating. And like with White Goddess, I wanted to know what the inspiration for it was, and that's the song Master Stroke of a Fairy Feller. I'm not sure if you've heard that song. Like I said, Queen 2, not their most famous album. If you look it up, it's the lyrics to it are completely confusing. If you have no idea what it's talking about, it's going on about this weird fairy tale, all these references to characters that you have no idea what it's talking about. So if you listen to the song and actually pay attention to the lyrics, your first response is going to be like, what is going on in this song? What is it talking about? So that was what I wanted to dive into and sort of explain on that album. And it's basically, to summarize the chapter, it's about outsider art, and it's kind of deals with Freddie's life. And the question I'm asking is, should Freddie be understood as an outsider artist or not? Outsider art is this whole movement in modern art and aesthetics that, to put very briefly, the idea is art from people that are outside of mainstream society, oftentimes art of the mentally ill, or something along these lines. People that either for psychological reasons are sort of disconnected from mainstream rational, culture, or are literally work of artists in prisons, or that are removed from culture, or solitary hermits that lived in the woods for, their whole life. And then you find that they painted all these paintings on their death, and this kind of a thing. So there's been an interest in this. And so I talk about that movement and what's going on there and why people are interested in it. But in particular, the reason I bring it up is because that song, the Master Stroke of a Fairy Feller. So my chapter is called Master Stroke of a Fairy Feller. The song is called The Fairy Feller's Master Stroke, because I'm making things confusing for myself. But that song is based on a painting of the same name, The Fairy Feller's Master Stroke. It's in the Tate, in Britain. Is a relatively famous painting, and it was painted by a guy named Richard dad who had a very complicated life. To make the story shorter, basically, when he was in his 20s, went insane on a trip, thought he was hearing the voice of the god Osiris, came back to Britain and murdered his father, and then was put in mental institutions for the rest of his life. So he'd been a very promising painter and then ended up in mental institutions. And while he was locked up, basically, this was one of his paintings. And I'll leave the details of how it ends up getting discovered and put into the museum. You can read the chapter on that. It's kind of an interesting story. But finds its way into this famous museum, and Freddie was obsessed with this painting. They even has like quotes and mentioned in some of their biographies that he would drag the other members of the band to go see this painting with him. He mentioned in an interview when he was talking about this song, he said that even though he was an artist, he went to art school. He says that he very rarely was inspired by artworks for his songs, but this song was an exception. So I found that fascinating. What was it that drew him to this particular artwork, right? What was it about this that was so compelling to him that he decided to write this song sort of in honor of it? And so, yeah, that's basic. The premise of it is, what's going on with this crazy song? Why was Freddie so interested and inspired by this artwork? And then thinking about these themes of outsider art and kind of tying that into Freddie's biography, is the discussion, basically the personal discussion of Freddie's life. It boils down to, there's this interesting tension. Well, I found very interesting, because on the one hand, Freddie is he's penetrated sort of to the height of global culture, right? He's a star, he's everywhere, even within his lifetime, right? He is recognized by not just his own culture, but even global culture. So on the one hand, you say, well, he can't be an outsider. He's literally he is the inside, like he's deciding culture right now. But at the same time, there's this tension where, yes, there is Freddie Mercury, but there's also Farouk Bulsara. Freddie was painfully shy. He was an immigrant. He comes from this religious minority, Zoroastrianism, that not a lot of people know about. He gets persecuted for that. He gets persecuted for his heritage, his immigrant status. He has, hyperdontia, so that gives him sort of a disfigurement, a little bit dental disfigurement that he is painfully aware of his entire life. He would hide his smile whenever he laughed or smiled so that people wouldn't see his face. Some of these like painfully outsider kind of qualities, right? And so that paradox of how does this shy, outsider character manage to become and to create himself as, because it's an act of creation. Like he builds this persona very meticulously and intentionally. So how does that happen? And is he still haunted by some of this outsider heritage? The movie, Bohemian Rhapsody movie, shows this a little bit when it shows him visiting his family and his upbringing, and within like a more religious and conservative kind of a household. And that paradox is kind of an interesting one. So that's sort of what I'm exploring in that chapter. I talked about that for a long time, I know. I would say so. My co-editor, Randall Oxshire, obviously he's great at these kinds of. He's done a lot of these philosophy, pop culture, and philosophy books and chapters, and especially when he's on music, because he is an excellent musician as well. Those are always especially good. So he has 3 chapters in the book. They're all, I would highly recommend. They're some of the best chapters in the book. I would say the one that I found most interesting is the one I mentioned this earlier. His is the chapter. It's called The Quintessence of Queen, which is, first of all, is a great title. But quintessence is an alchemy term. So he's talking about alchemy, almost like alchemy and magic, and combining different pieces together to create something that's greater than the whole. And that's the chapter that I was talking about with he is the one that does the analysis of the left hands. So he has this musical analysis of how could just these four people create this big, giant, live sound. And so he has his own particular theory on that, and he kind of draws on alchemy. And so I mentioned I'm a big fan of like philosophy of mythology and some of these things. And I also like this esotericism, and philosophy of Western esotericism is super interesting and cool to me. So that chapter is great, but all of his chapters are I highly recommend. I also really like, so Megan Volpert did a chapter. She's the one who, so her chapter is Adam Lambert a killer of queens or somebody to love? So she's the one that talks about whether Queen should still be Queen with Adam Lambert or not. And she does she draws on the old philosophical concept of the ship of Theseus from the ancient Greeks. Do you know the concept of the ship of Theseus? I'll go real quickly. It's basically the idea of, if you have a ship, like a sailing ship, and over time the ship gets worn down and pieces start to get replaced, right? So you take off the mast and you replace the mast, and you take off the sail and you replace the sail. And eventually, let's say that this ship is now 100% it's been remade, right? Okay, so you have this new ship that has been Theseus, so Theseus from the ancient Greek, Theseus. So his ship has now been entirely replaced. But what if we took like all those old pieces and then we rebuilt in the harbor the original sort of ship of Theseus, right? And so it's asking these questions about identity, and she talks about Heraclitus and some of the process philosophy of changing over time, and how does identity stay the same over time? So is it still Theseus's ship? Why? That kind of question. So is it still Queen, even if we can we change out the pieces, change out the parts, and is it still Queen or not? And so I thought that was very interesting, and a fun use of a very famous classic sort of philosophical idea. I also really liked John Shook's chapter, so it's called We Want to Love Forever. Forever is Ours Today. So he's the one that did a musical analysis of Who Wants to Live Forever. And he also makes use of one of my own personal favorite philosophers. He was actually a partial subject of my dissertation. His name's Gabriel Marcel. So he's like a French existentialist. So he's talking about these themes of love and immortality, kind of in the context of Highlander, the film Highlander, where they're these immortals battling it out, and kind of asking this question of, would we want to love forever? These sorts of themes like love and immortality and death, all these big existentialist themes. So those are some of my personal favorites that resonated with themes that I find interesting. Like I said, I talk about Marcel in my dissertation. I'm a big fan of process philosophy, so I'm sure other people would find chapters that they resonated with a little bit more. But those are some of my favorites. So if we talk writing, just like in the broadest sense, probably the first thing is I just read a ton when I was a kid for a long time. I mean, don't read as much anymore, but I used to read pretty much nonstop, especially fantasy books and things like this. So I've always been interested in reading, and then therefore writing. And I like to write fiction in my, just for fun and these kinds of things. And then when I, down the line, gave up my dreams of being a rock musician and became a philosopher instead, writing philosophy then became a passion as well. But in particular for this book, and this is kind of the thing that I mentioned I wanted to talk about, is not just writing in general, but specifically writing like for a popular philosophy is something that to me, I think is very important, and is something that I'm passionate about. For a lot of very complicated reasons that I won't get into right now. But philosophy is not um, always seen or understood as kind of a popular discipline in this country. By popular, I mean not just that it's like well liked or something, but that it's for the people, right? We Philosophy is seen as this thing that's only for academics or only for people that go on and they get their degrees and they write these books that are just for them to read and no one else is supposed to read it. Um, and we philosophers kind of let a lot of other intellectuals do the popular philosophy, right? Like a lot of that work is done just by journalists and writers that write books and articles in newspapers and magazines and things like this. That in a lot of other countries, some of that is being done by philosophers, right? Like it's not unheard of to see a philosopher on TV in France talking about a popular issue in the day in the news or something like that. I do think that's changing some with sort of digital media and digital technology. There is a lot more resources. You can find people that are passionate about philosophy that are doing it on YouTube or doing blogs or doing like the digital magazine Aeon is a great resource. They got a lot of really great essays and writings for people, everyone, not just academic philosophers to read. But so that was kind of one of the things that I was most passionate about and that drew me to writing this particular book is because I don't think that philosophy should be something that is only for a small segment of people, and I don't think that it's something that uh, I don't want to say normal people, right? But like quote unquote, right? Uh, it is for everyone, right? It is something that I think adds value and can add value when it's done well, can add value to nearly everyone's life. And so these kinds of books and the series that you guys are doing at Carus, you know, I think is really important work, whether it's popular culture in music or in film or in other things, but just trying to show people that philosophy matters to them and can be interesting to them. It's hard to do because it's a lot harder to write something that people want to read, right? Than it is to write something that you only care about if you happen to be one of the handful of academics that specialize in that area or something. Like you actually have to write it in a way that people won't put it down and get bored. And so that's a tough challenge, but it makes it exciting, and I do think that it's important. So I'm not sure if that answers the question why I wanted to be a writer, but for this particular book, that was some of my motivations for writing it. I wouldn't say it changed in any drastic way. I would say deepened probably is the, it gave me a chance to, first of all, reacquaint myself with one of my longtime favorite bands, that I've been a fan of since I was a kid. Gave me an excuse to listen to more of their music and to learn more about them and to study them in a sort of a deeper way, in a different way. Even being a philosopher and loving Queen, it doesn't always occur to you to stop and go like, well, why don't we bring these two together? And so, yeah, I would say definitely it deepened my appreciation for the thoughtfulness of their songwriting, right? Like I was impressed that they did have such sophisticated inspirations behind their songs, like the two chapters that I wrote that I mentioned. It was very interesting inspirations for those songs, for their showmanship. How carefully they crafted their persona from the name of the band to the logo to Freddie's own changing of his name to the live performances and the costumes and the theatrics and the music videos. How intentional and thoughtful and creative and interesting that was. Um, yeah, but just in general, I'd say deepened my appreciation for them. Uh, yeah, and it was fun. I will say I always answer, my number one is March of the Black Queen. That's the song that I mentioned from Queen 2. I have to advocate for this song again because I think people don't listen to that album very much. They don't really know. The song is amazing. It is a better Bohemian Rhapsody written before Bohemian Rhapsody. You know, it has all of the like the majesty and the changing and the like the uh, just the interesting musicality that Bohemian Rhapsody is. It's as epic, if not more, in my opinion. And it's got these great themes and you know, references and allusions to fairy tale and mythology and all these kinds of things. I think that song is amazing. I always say that's my favorite Queen song, just to give people something to say like, I should try and go listen to that song, because I really think that song should be more popular than it is. But again, I'm a hipster, I guess. So that's my number one. Number two is a little more mainstream. So I would say Don't Stop Me Now. It's if there's one song in the world that if I'm feeling depressed or in a bad mood or whatever, that I can put on and will guaranteed 100% of the time make me feel better, make me more excited, make me happier, it's Don't Stop Me Now. You know, so just for that alone, I've done that many times in my life. Just go on a walk in the woods, listen to Queen, put on Don't Stop Me Now. You instantly feel better. This is my life advice. And then third was hard, but I'm going to go ahead and say Killer Queen. That's a great song. I find the lyrics are so absurd, but so powerfully, like the images are very so, you know, powerful. Again, I like the strong female figure idea that Queen has, and it's just a great song. One of my favorites. But you know, there's Bicycle Race. There's all these songs. So
I was gonna say Bicycle Race has got to be one of my favorites. So
that's on the top for sure. Yeah, it's hard to choose. They have so many. I say in my like, I think I wrote this in the maybe one of my chapters, could be the introduction. I think it's one of my chapters. I mention so when I was a kid growing up, when you're young, you hear the songs, but you don't know what's like, you don't know the band, or you don't, none of that is relevant to you. You just hear the songs. And then as you get older, you get to a certain age, you sort of start to put things together. You're like, oh, there's this band, and I had this experience when I was younger. Like as I was getting to that stage, I realized like there were two bands that I found had written like all of my favorite songs. One was the Beatles and one was Queen.